bonsoir à toutes et à tous, et donc bienvenue à l'Institut d'études avancées. Ça fait depuis quelques années que j'ai présenté beaucoup d'invités ici, d'auteurs de livres, mais c'est la première fois qu'il y a un auteur que je connais si bien. Et pour cause, c'est mon frère Sandy Tolan qui nous fait l'honneur de venir de Los Angeles. Et s'il vient de Los Angeles, où il est professeur de journalisme à l'University of Southern California, c'est parce que il participe à la 20e anniversaire de l'association Kamandjâti, dont vous allez entendre beaucoup parler ce soir. Et tout ça, c'est venu d'une rencontre en Palestine, il y a 25 ans peut-être, entre Ramzi et Sandy. Et ensuite, Ramzi, moi j'ai rencontré il y a plus de 20 ans, quand il était étudiant au conservatoire en musique à Nantes, à Angers, et il a ensuite, après ses études de musique à Angers, il a monté cette association Kamandjâti, qui en arabe veut dire le violoniste, et il est retourné en Palestine où il a monté un réseau d'écoles de musique pour mener ce qu'il aime appeler son intifada musicale. Et donc, ce livre de Sandy, Children of the Stone, le pouvoir de la musique dans la traduction française, raconte l'histoire de Ramzi et ceux qui l'entourent dans cette intifada musicale. Et sans dire plus, je vais céder la parole aux deux. En général, dans ces soirées, on parle, donc nos invités vont parler grosso modo 1 heure, et ensuite ça va nous laisser du temps de discuter et vous permettrait de poser des questions. Donc merci beaucoup à tous les deux d'être ici, c'est un grand plaisir et je vous donne la parole.
Merci.
Donc, la conférence serait en anglais, mais les discussions peuvent se faire en anglais et en français.
D'accord. Moi, je parle en français. Parce que là, il faut un petit quand même exercice avant pour parler en anglais facilement. Donc, merci John pour l'introduction. Et je crois que je vais peut-être laisser Sandy commencer. Et puis ensuite, moi, je prends la parole. Et puis, je pense pas qu'on on parlera 1 heure. Je pense qu'on va peut-être aussi vite ouvrir la discussion aux questions et puis créer un dialogue parce que voilà, je pense que ça sera encore plus riche en ayant vos questions, en espérant qu'il y a quelques-uns qui ont lu le livre avant et qui ont des questions. Voilà. Sandy, maybe
You want me to maybe
start? Yes. Yeah.
Merci beaucoup. I want to thank everyone for coming, especially mon frère. And it's really such an honor to take part in this, knowing, when I was working on the book with Ramzi, starting in maybe around 2010, 2011, I would come, I did a lot of work in Angers where Ramzi studied, as you know. So I would get up in the morning in Nantes at John and Michel's and take the train to Angers, and it was like I was commuting. It was a wonderful, happy coincidence. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm sorry that I don't speak good French or hardly any French at all. So thank you for your patience. I'll just tell a little story about how Ramzi and I met. I was in Ramallah in 1998, and I was working on what would become my first a radio program for National Public Radio in the United States, and then it became a book called The Lemon Tree, which was the first book on Palestine and Israel that I wrote. And I was very busy trying to find the right kind of characters, the people. I was doing a lot of reporting, and that was supposed to be my main focus. But I saw all over Ramallah, there were these posters. In 1998, it was the very beginning of, was not right at the very beginning of the peace process, but the so-called Oslo peace process, where a lot of people at that time thought that this is going to lead to two independent states, not just Israel, but also Palestine, two equal, or at least states that with a genuine state. And there was something in this picture, this poster I saw. It was a poster for the emerging National Conservatory of Music in Palestine, and it had two images on it. One was a picture of Ramzi, this 8-year-old boy with a stone in his hand, in the process of throwing. It's a very famous picture of the First Intifada. You might have seen it, even not associated with Ramzi. He had this anger and resolve and this power in his eyes, and he was throwing at a stone at an unseen Israeli soldier. At the time, he was living with his grandparents in the Al-Amari refugee camp near Ramallah. In that same poster was a picture of an older person who turned out to be the same person, Ramzi, pulling his viola bow across the strings of his viola. And then underneath it said, Palestine National Conservatory of Music. And it seemed to capture a lot of the spirit of the time, but it was also, for a journalist, I was supposed to be on one assignment, and I said, I have to go find this guy. I have to meet him. There's a great story there, I know. So when we first met, you were, I think we did some interviews in Al-Amari, and Ramzi had just started playing music. Maybe a year or two before. Yeah, maybe when you were 16 you started?
Yes.
So it was maybe 2 years. And he had just, the previous year, gone to New Hampshire to what's called the Apple Hill Music Camp in the summer of 97, I think. 97, yeah. Yes. And so he was a very young, just beginning musician. But during the course of our interviews, I did a long piece for National Public Radio at the time. I asked Ramzi, what is your dream? And what do you want to do? And he said, well, I have a chance maybe to get a scholarship and come and study in Alger. And I didn't know where Alger was. I didn't know anything about. And he had this idea. And I said, well, so what? So you're going to study, what after that? He goes, well, I want to study. I get really good at being a musician and but I want to come back and show people that we Palestinians can do anything in the world. And we're going to be our own state. And I'm going to come back and I'm going to start a music school for the children of Palestine. Now, here was a teenager at the time. As I was saying to the students over in Alger today, didn't have a lot of money, and was living with his family in the refugee camp, but he had an incredible brain and an incredible heart. And, I came a couple of times, I think I came to visit John and Michelle in Alger, in Nantes, and we visited once or twice when you were just starting at the school. But there was this. He still had this idea. But at the time, I thought, well, that's a very lovely idea. That's a huge dream, and he didn't have a lot of, financial wherewithal at the time. And I thought, well, that's a beautiful dream. But then we lost touch. I wasn't in touch with him for almost 10 years. And then one time, I had an assignment to do another story in Palestine. It was in 2008, I think. So 10 years after I met him. And I walked into an Italian restaurant in Ramallah called Pronto. So I walked in and I was working on this other assignment about the failure of the so-called peace process 10 years after I had met Ramzi. And I hear this voice across the restaurant. It says, Sandy, Sandy. And I looked, and there was this man I didn't recognize, because when I had met Ramzi, he was clean-shaven. And at the time, I was clean-shaven. when I saw him, but he had grown a beard, and I look, and he said, "Ramzi," and so we met in the restaurant, and it had been such a long time. I said, "Well, I thought you were still in Angers. Why are you back here?" He goes, "Oh no, I started that music school for the children of Palestine." So after 10 years of this dream, he had actually begun, and he invited me to come the next day. I think it was the next day to embark on this what I thought would be a short feature for the radio, and maybe just do a quick story to tell about this man who had a dream, and then he actually built it. But then 5 years later, I was still working on the book, and here we are 12 years after that. So just wanted to talk a little bit about how we were introduced.
Yes, and thank you, Sandy. Thank you. Merci, Sandy. You want to use the translation thing? Like this, I can speak in French. J'étais plus confortable en anglais avant, mais maintenant je suis plus confortable en français. C'est vrai que quand Sandy, quand on s'est vu et puis quand on s'est rencontrés, il m'a parlé de travailler sur le livre. Moi, j'ai immédiatement pensé que ça va être un travail que j'ai l'habitude ou quelque chose que j'ai eu l'habitude de faire à travers des interviews, parce que j'avais déjà, sur les 10 ans après mon départ en France en 1998, j'ai eu l'occasion de faire beaucoup d'interviews avec des journaux, des télévisions, des magazines. Donc j'ai eu l'habitude de pouvoir m'exprimer et parler aux médias, en fait. Et tout à l'heure, en fait, quand on était à l'école, il y avait un jeune qui m'a posé la question, est-ce qu'il était facile de parler de ton histoire, en fait? Est-ce qu'il était facile, il a posé la question aussi à Sandy, est-ce qu'il était facile pour toi d'entendre une histoire autant que journaliste? Et j'ai découvert que c'était beaucoup plus difficile de ce que je pensais, et surtout que on n'est plus dans une dynamique juste de poser une question et attendre la réponse. Sandy était à la recherche de détails pour pouvoir enrichir et dire une histoire. Donc et moi j'étais resté sur ce que je connais par cœur, toutes les speeches que j'ai appris à répéter, qui est presque devenu standard. Mais c'est vrai que j'ai jamais été allé sur le profond de mon histoire. Et donc c'est là où vraiment j'ai découvert que ça va être beaucoup plus compliqué que ce que je pensais. Et donc j'ai eu beaucoup de blocages au début, parce que c'était des moments, des questions qui parlaient beaucoup de moments de ma vie personnelle, beaucoup de moments de tragédie difficiles à dire. Et comme nous on grandit dans une société comme notre société palestinienne, qu'on apprend dès petit qu'on est fort. Il faut toujours montrer qu'on est fort, psychologiquement parlant, et jamais montrer sa faiblesse et jamais montrer ses points de weakness, comme on dit, de précaire, en fait. Et donc c'était difficile de dire tous les moments difficiles, et c'est là où, en fait, où tout est devenu intéressant. Ça veut dire et c'est là où Sandy aussi m'a ouvert mon esprit, puis qui m'a aidé, et ça m'a même servi presque d'une thérapie, en fait, de dire des choses que j'osais pas dire. Et puis une fois que j'avais bien compris, en fait, l'enjeu, en fait, de rentrer dans le détail, j'ai immédiatement compris que ça peut aussi servir à beaucoup d'autres gens, en fait, qui gardent leur histoire. Vous savez, en France, lorsque quelqu'un a un problème interne, il suffit de tourner à droite, à gauche, il va chez un psychologue ou un psychiatre et c'est réglé. Et nous, il n'y en a pas ça dans les pays comme la Palestine. Il n'y a pas de psychiatre, psychologue, ou s'il y en a, c'est récent, en fait, où on peut aller évacuer et dire et sortir tout comment on dit, le traumatisme de notre enfance, parce que d'un côté, ce que j'avais dit à un des jeunes cet après-midi, on est heureux de devenir mature assez tôt. Moi, j'ai commencé à travailler à l'âge de 6 ans. Et d'un côté, c'est triste qu'on n'a pas pu vivre notre enfance. Donc, c'est un arme à double tranchant. Donc, je disais tout à l'heure, je disais que mon fils est là en avant. Aujourd'hui, à Angers, on est à 200 mètres de l'école. Qu'à partir de cette année, on l'a laissé partir à l'école tout seul. Et à l'âge de 6 ans, moi, je sortais à 4 heures du matin pour aller vendre les journaux. Et je marchais dans les rues de Ramallah avec des chiens sauvages dans la rue. Donc, à l'âge de 6 ans, hein, ça veut dire j'avais à peine, j'étais un peu plus grand que le chien. Voilà. Donc mais ce que je disais, que c'était un arme à double tranchant parce que d'un côté, on est mature assez tôt, et d'un côté, on a perdu quand même une bonne partie de notre enfance, et ajoute surtout ça, toute la tragédie de l'occupation, le traumatisme qu'on a par l'occupation tous les jours, et l'humiliation. Mais ce que j'ai dit aussi, c'est que il faut toujours, moi j'ai toujours gardé les bons côtés des choses, que canaliser cette énergie pour faire de bien. Donc j'étais mature tôt, c'est pas grave, ça m'a permis d'avoir toujours une avance, de toujours réfléchir, savoir comment regrouper, aider, convaincre les gens pour me soutenir dans mes idées. C'est ce qui a été le cas quand on a créé l'association Kamandjâti en année 2000, et ça m'a donné de pouvoir additionnel pour pouvoir convaincre, et donc cette maturité a eu un résultat, et j'ai pu la détourner en positif après en commençant les écoles de musique et tous les événements et le développement culturel et musical qu'on a mené en Palestine.
So one of the things I wanted to talk about is from the collaboration that we did. You know, there's always, between a journalist and the subject that the journalist is writing about, the people that you interview, there's always a little bit of a natural tension, because the journalist's purpose and the person who's interviewing that journalist, they have different goals. The journalist wants to get as much story as they can, as many details as they can. And there were times where Ramzi said, I don't remember what my grandpa wore to work in 1978 or 1982 or whenever it was. And so in one way, I think, exasperated him. But at the same time, I know that I think we grew over the period of several years, probably 50 interviews, and we would sit in this beautiful stone on this bench in this beautiful courtyard that is the main center of Kamandjâti in Ramallah. And I think after a time, Ramzi understood that I was really serious about getting his story right, but I was also asking him very personal questions. You know, he's had, not only was his family, subject to the Nakba in 1948, but also there's been a lot of tragedy, like in many Palestinian families, and it was difficult for him to open up. And over time, we grew to trust each other, I think, after a while. But one of the reasons that I wanted to pursue it so much, and many writers sometimes think, well, it's going to take a year or two, and I'm going to write this book, and it'll be done, and it's not that. I'm going to make it a small book this time. It was 5 years, 5-year project, and it was a work from the heart. But one of the reasons I wanted to tell this story in the United States in particular, now I'm so happy that it's in French as well, is, I'm sure it won't be surprising to anybody here to know that in the U.S. especially, it's not exactly pro-Palestinian media. And I think, you know, the main narrative in the United States is that Israel needs to be safe. And that's the end of the story. That's the beginning of the story and the end of the story. And no one, and politicians, as you may have heard, everyone from Joe Biden to Barack Obama to Donald Trump will say, you know, Israel has the right to defend itself. No one ever asks, do Palestinians also have the right to defend themselves? Do Palestinians have the right to have their own country, to have the freedom of movement, instead of having their children subjected to checkpoints, and the children of Ramzi's music school subjected to checkpoints when they're coming back to Ramallah from a concert in Bethlehem? And what attracted me, not only because of Ramzi's incredible personality and heart to this story, was the opportunity to communicate in human terms what it's like, number one, to be a child living under a military occupation. Also, what it's like for one person in a sort of universal story to have a dream that you pursue under incredibly difficult circumstances. And also for people in the United States and beyond, so much of what we know about Palestine and Israel is grounded in tragedy. It's grounded in misery. It's grounded in being a refugee. It's grounded in being dispossessed. It's grounded in blood. And you know, what do people know? And you sometimes feel like you're seeing history again and again, repeating itself all the time. You know, a bus explodes in Tel Aviv, or children are shot down. Children like Ramzi, shot down with a stone in their hand. Tanks rolling into the occupation, continuing the occupation. Civilian casualties of 200 or 300 to 1 when you're looking at Israel's assault on Gaza in 2014. A lot of that part of it, that inequity does not get reported very well in the U.S. But that sense of tragedy and of bloodshed and of trauma is what people identify with. What so attracted me, in addition to Ramzi, about writing about him, about taking the time to actually do a book, was to show that music has an incredible power to transform people's lives, even when you're in the middle of a situation like that, when you're in the middle of a military occupation. We can talk a little bit more about that, but part of what I wanted to do with the book is to show what is ordinary life for Palestinians like. It's not just tragedy. It's about beauty. It's about love. It's about longing for land that you might have only heard about. There are Palestinians in refugee camps whose grandparents draw pictures of the maps of the villages that they left in 1948. That sense of longing is also love, and with the music school, there was this opportunity to tell a story in which all these children had so much hope and so much protection, actual little protection, because of the instrument they were playing. And we could talk a little bit more about that later if you like.
I think we can open maybe the questions,
sure,
because I
absolutely.
think time running.
Yeah.
And maybe we can open the question. If there's no question, we keep talking, no problem.
We can talk.
Et la première question, toujours, c'est la plus difficile. C'est la plus... pas la plus dure. It's not on. I muted because...
C'est bon. Thank you very much. It's really interesting what you're telling us. And I would like to ask you, Sandy, a question about the dominant discourse in the West about Israel and its right to defend itself, and it has to survive, and so on and so forth. and the Palestinians, nothing. We don't hear anything about them. So how can we challenge this dominant discourse, when politics are not ready to discuss it, and nobody is, people in power are not really challenging this.
Yeah.
Nobody comes out and says, wait a second, there is something wrong. There is imbalance there. So how can we challenge it? And how can you and people like you working in the occupied territories could bring this out and help in illuminating, the public's opinion about what's happening there? Thank you so much.
It's a very good question, and it's a very hard question to answer. I have a lot that I've thought about. I have this way of looking at, and I can't really speak for France because I don't know the discourse here. I think it's more progressive than the United States, although that's not saying a lot. I understand, but what in the United States, there's what I call the Leon Uris narrative. If you remember the book the Exodus by Leon Uris, and then there was a movie with Paul Newman, and it was a blockbuster, and the book sold more than 1 million copies, and it was the story of Israel's rise out of the ashes of the Holocaust. And that narrative is very powerful, and so much of it is very true, of course. But that was, again, the end of the story. The Arabs, never say Palestinian so often it's the Israeli Arabs or the Arabs. I've never heard Ramzi or anyone refer to themselves, I'm an Israeli Arab. It's a way to sort of keep the narrative small, and it in Uris's book, Palestinians essentially didn't exist. They were either terrorists or pathetic, and there's a line in there that says something like they didn't actually really have anything to do with the land. It was this whole way of denying the Palestinian existence on the land. And if you look, when I started doing research in for the Lemon Tree and then later for this book, the amount of melons and grapes and olives and oranges and just tonnage and tonnage of people Palestinian farmers who were on the land for hundreds of years. This whole reality has been essentially denied in the U.S. discourse, and so what I call it the Leon Uris discourse is Israel was born out of the ashes of the Holocaust, beginning and end of story, and that's where I think the sort of Israel needs to be safe beginning and end of story starts. So starts and ends. So I think that's still a very dominant narrative. I mean, no doubt in the West and certainly in the United States, maybe more than anywhere. I also think, that's one of the things that motivated me most in writing this book, other than being attracted to the story, is there a chance to just start shifting the discourse? And, it's hard to say, what is it about chaos theory that, a butterfly flaps its wings in the Caribbean and there's a typhoon in Southeast Asia. You don't know what impact you have. You don't know what impact the story is going to have. And I've found, that I've had impact on stories I had no idea. That's a sort of optimistic way of looking at it. The pessimistic way is that it hasn't really changed the power dynamics at all. I mean, Joe Biden is one of the biggest apologists for Israel, and he's now our president. I mean, he went as vice president to Israel in 2010 and proclaimed the U.S. ironclad eternal commitment to Israel. And as he was leaving, Benjamin Netanyahu announced the construction of 1,700 new apartment buildings in East Jerusalem. So, and now he's president. Donald Trump was terrible. He did move the embassy, which was one of the worst individual acts in the last 20 some years by a U.S. president. But no U.S. president since before the beginning of the peace process in 1998 or 1994, has actually threatened Israel with economic consequences if they don't stop building settlements, right? The last person to do that was James Baker, who was the Secretary of State under George Bush I. So that just goes to what is this peace process if there are no consequences to? So in that sense, I don't think the narrative has changed a lot. But one thing has changed. I think the terrible, tragic assault on Gaza in 2014, I think that changed some minds. I think social media has been freed from the power of the gatekeepers, the Washington Post, the New York Times especially. I mean, each of those papers, I mean, there are individual fantastic reporters who have done really brave work, but generally that narrative is to keep the sort of Israel needs to be safe mantra as the central thing. But with some of the social media and some of the other cracks in the narrative, the assault on Gaza in 2014 was so horrific. You had, the story of those children on the beach, the family, the cousins. This is horrible. And then, these guys were watching a soccer match, and they were just completely wiped out by a missile. And there were people in Sderot, who's the Israeli border community. They were pulling up couches and sometimes eating popcorn and cheering for the bombs that were falling. I think some of this became more evident, and people just thought this has gone too far. And I think if you look at some of the polling among younger people, including younger American Jews, that's shifting. And so, if you take a long view, which Ramzi, you can describe, your own, whether you have a long view. I think a lot of Palestinians do have a long view, and maybe, until there's a real power dynamic shift in the United States, I'm skeptical. But my former wife, Lami Sandoni, used to quote Emil Habibi saying, "I'm a pes-optimist." He wrote a book called The Pes-Optimist, pessimistic in the short term, optimistic in the long term. I would like to be a pes-optimist.
Thank you. I just follow up on that because, you said you talked about the 2014, but it was not the last assault from the Israeli side. And the development was not positive afterwards. So I don't see much of a difference between before 2014, and after 2014. But you can comment on that, or
I'll add something, and I want to know what Ramzi thinks too. But I think when I was talking about the positive developments, is there seems to be a shift in opinion among young people. But at the Obama was president in 2014, in the middle of this horrible assault on Gaza, where the civilian casualty ratio was 300 to 1. In the middle of this, the United States replenished the Israeli military stockpile. I mean, to provide more weapons while supposedly giving lip service to a truce. So the power dynamics have not shifted at all. And the fact that Biden's president instead of Trump in many ways is good, but in this context, I don't see much difference. But Ramzi, I don't know. What do you think?
I think I maybe take another question because I think you answered very well on the question.
Oops. Maybe I'll stand. It's just easier since I'm standing up. Est-ce que c'est mieux que peut-être que je vais poser la question en français. Je vais me présenter. Je suis Julia Tori, un des fellows de cette année ici à l'Institut. Et j'avais une question qui m'est venue parce que Sandy Tolan a parlé du fait que l'agriculture palestiniens étaient niés par, enfin dans le livre de Léon Uris, mais c'est quelque chose qu'on voit chez un colonialiste plus généralement, qu'on nie l'agriculture ou les cultures du pays qu'on envahit. Et je voulais savoir, Monsieur Aburedwan, Ramzi, bonjour. Si pour vous la culture musicale est une façon de contrarier ce genre de discours, que les Palestiniens n'auraient pas d'agriculture, mais aussi pas de culture plus généralement. Et je ne sais pas si vous voulez faire un commentaire là-dessus.
Ouais, je me suis toujours posé la question, quel est le lien entre l'agriculture et la culture? Pourquoi il y a un mot commun? Je ne sais pas si quelqu'un a la réponse, mais et je suis sûr qu'il y a un lien, et c'est lien à l'identité, à la culture en fait des peuples, aux premières nécessités. Et c'est pour ça en fait, depuis en fait, je peux vous dire depuis qu'on a commencé le projet de l'association Kamandjâti, la culture est devenue et on est fiers en fait parmi les outils de résistance. Quand on parlait ça il y a 20 ans, les gens ils comprenaient pas en fait comment on peut résister par la musique, comment on peut rester avec l'art. Mais aujourd'hui, tous les artistes dans tous les domaines artistiques réclament on résiste par l'art, parce qu'en fait on a compris que l'art c'est notre identité, c'est notre façon de s'exprimer, c'est ce qu'on peut reporter pour dire comment on vit, parce qu'à travers la musique, la peinture, la poésie, on s'exprime, et on s'exprime de ce qu'on vit. Et c'est presque le reporter de notre vie de tous les jours. Et c'est le maintien et la continuité de la tradition de nos ancêtres, en fait, qu'on essaye en fait d'effacer, parce que vous avez remarqué que le gouvernement israélien n'a jamais cessé de voler même des choses très essentielles dans la culture, la broderie palestinienne, la nourriture palestinienne, et même la musique. Aujourd'hui, on est en train de réclamer que la musique bédouine est originaire israélienne. Donc en fait, on est vraiment sur un domaine que je pense il n'y a pas eu beaucoup de conscience en fait, et beaucoup de concentration sur ce domaine-là auparavant. Et aujourd'hui on est beaucoup plus conscient de l'importance de maintenir aussi notre culture, parce que c'est quand même parmi les piliers de ce qui nous représente en fait. C'est notre identité, et très fier qu'aujourd'hui qu'on a intégré les cultures et les arts parmi les outils de résistance. Et quand on disait ça au début, les gens ils faisaient ça en fait. Mais je peux vous dire que il y a 4 ans, le ministre des Affaires étrangères israélien nous a nominés, nous et peut-être 3 ou 4 organisations palestiniennes, parmi les organisations qui font menace à Israël et qui retransmet des informations contre l'État d'Israël. Alors on fait que de la musique, vous voyez. Et donc on était nominés sur le ministre de monitoring israélien. En fait, vous allez sur le site, vous allez voir nos noms et voir nous, ils disent ce petit jeune qui se prétend à jouer de la musique, terroriste. En fait, je suis terroriste d'apprendre la musique aux enfants. Donc en fait, on termine jamais avec un système colonial. Tout ce qu'on fait, il va toujours trouver une solution pour nous arrêter, parce qu'il voit le danger. Pour la première fois, on a toujours trouvé une solution d'esquiver en fait toutes les restrictions à Jérusalem-Est pour mener un festival pendant 4 ans dans Jérusalem-Est. Et pour la première fois, il y a 2 semaines, le gouverneur israélien en fait de la municipalité d'occupation à Jérusalem, il a sorti un décret nous interdisant de faire aucun événement à Jérusalem-Est, culturel, musical, avec des organisations palestiniennes qui devraient normalement déranger personne. C'est que des concerts de nuit de Ramadan. Et donc c'est là on peut comprendre qu'en fait que la culture est devenue aussi un pilier de résistance.
C'est la marque de votre succès, peut-être. Merci.
If I could just add quickly to that, one of the most powerful things I ever saw was when Ramzi led a group of children into Kalandia checkpoint. If any of you know where that is, it is like a border crossing. It's like an international border, a 25-foot wall, machine gun nests, Israeli soldiers everywhere. And Ramzi and a few other teachers and about 24 children walked right into the Kalandia checkpoint, right in front of these bars that look like prison bars, and Israeli soldiers are just on the other side. And they walked in, and the soldiers were looking, and they began playing Mozart. And it was the most beautiful concert I've ever heard. And, you know, there was children, but it was so powerful. And this is why they're saying these things to you, because they see you as a threat. And that means that you've succeeded.
On n'a pas terminé la traduction. Amar Mohandamer, historien d'Algérie, fellow à l'Institut de Nantes. Merci Sandy Tolan, merci Ramzi Aburedwan. Je souhaiterais savoir du côté palestinien, comment ta musique, ton outil de résistance, comment il est appréhendé, il est pensé par d'un côté l'autorité palestinienne, par les autres groupes politiques. Est-ce qu'il y a un soutien? Est-ce qu'il y a une reconnaissance? Je prends un exemple. Pendant de longues décennies, Mahmoud Darwish, le grand poète, était un des symboles, peut-être le symbole de la résistance palestinienne. Et moi, aujourd'hui, peut-être, je ne sais pas, je dirais pas, je m'intéresse pas à la question palestinienne, mais est-ce que l'art, la musique constitue aujourd'hui, comme il l'a été dans les années 60-70, un véritable ferment, un véritable outil de la cause palestinienne?
En fait, la musique elle est devenue aujourd'hui parmi les choses que un peuple devrait avoir dans un cas normal, et les enfants devraient avoir dans un cas normal. Donc lorsqu'on a commencé l'association al Kamandjâti, beaucoup de gens ils disaient qu'on faisait plus, ça veut dire qu'on apportait quelque chose de plus. Et moi je disais que on voulait juste apporter quelque chose pour donner le niveau normal pour un enfant de grandir dans une situation normale. Et pour moi, c'était l'objectif, en fait. Pour l'enfant, toute la partie philosophique de la musique, pour moi, c'était évident. Elle vient toute seule, en fait. Aujourd'hui, en fait, il n'y a pas de semaine ou jour qu'on a Kamandjâti ou les autres structures n'ont pas une demande pour faire de la musique. Donc, si c'était un village, une association, et ça montre qu'en fait, que la population, elle veut vivre, en fait, tout simplement. Elle veut vivre, elle veut exercer. Nous, le fait juste de mener une vie normale et de pouvoir exercer notre culture et des concerts, en soi même, une grande résistance. Et ce vent, en fait, il faut pas... Il y a le côté philosophique, il y a le côté pratique. Moi, ce qui m'intéresse le plus, c'est le côté pratique. C'est celui qui, comme des champignons, qui va le plus vite. Et c'est ça qui marche aujourd'hui. On a par an des centaines de familles qui viennent inscrire leurs enfants. Ils n'avaient pas cette possibilité. Aujourd'hui, si al Kamandjâti si ferme et on n'a plus d'argent et on n'a plus de soutien, on a des centaines de musiciens qui vont rester. Parce qu'on a formé 2 générations. Donc, même les générations qui étaient formées, ils peuvent juste ouvrir des cours privés et donner des cours tout seul, et la vie continue. Ce démarrage, le premier démarrage qu'on a fait, c'était vraiment le début de l'association et du projet, c'était le plus difficile. Comme par exemple former une dizaine de professeurs dans les camps de réfugiés de Shatila et Borje Balajné. Et ben là, c'était un très très grand challenge de le faire, parce que il n'y avait pas de professeurs palestiniens de musique, il fallait faire venir des professeurs de l'extérieur de camp. En fait, c'est comme la poule et l'œuf. Quand est-ce que ça va commencer? Donc on a travaillé pendant 10 ans, et là on a une génération qui elle travaille pas que à Shatila et Borje Balajné, mais dans tous les autres camps de réfugiés. Donc tout ça, c'est pour ramener au normal la vie de Palestinien, parce qu'il doit se charger d'énergie positive aussi, pour pouvoir résister longtemps. Parce qu'en fait, on est être humain. Quand on a faim, il faut manger. Quand on est triste, il faut doser, il faut qu'on devienne un peu plus heureux pour pouvoir construire. On ne peut pas produire si on est toujours triste. Et on ne peut pas produire et innover si on est toujours malheureux. Donc, il faut donner cette énergie à la jeunesse. L'autorité, elle voit très bien l'importance de ce qu'on fait. En 2017, le ministre de la Culture, Ehab Sesso, m'a nommé, moi-même, la personnalité de l'année culturelle. C'est ça, sa personnalité de l'année. Oui. Personnalité culturelle de l'année. Pardon. Voilà la traduction. Donc, et il a eu un grand titre qui s'appelait La culture était une résistance. Donc, c'est bon. Il y a un ministre un peu plus avancé, donc il a capté en fait, et donc il veut aller dans ce sens-là. Les organisations, à part les organisations internationales et quelques fondations, la culture ne pourra pas exister en fait vraiment comme c'est le cas. Et malheureusement aujourd'hui, Israël a réussi à pénétrer la Commission européenne, l'Union européenne, pour assurer des conditions politiques sur les financements de la Commission européenne. Ce qui a freiné là récemment, il y a même pas 2 ans, ce qui va freiner, sachant beaucoup de membres de la Commission européenne ne sont pas d'accord avec ces conditions. C'est des conditions politiques, ça veut dire que les organisations comme le Kamandjâti doivent contrôler avec qui ils travaillent, tel parti politique ou tel parti politique. Il ne faut pas qu'ils travaillent avec tel et tel. C'est pas notre travail. Donc Israël, elle est aussi à l'attaque en fait, même des organisations, mais dans l'ombre en fait. Elle fait son travail et nous on résiste. On était obligé de renoncer en fait à une grande convention avec 5 autres organisations à Jérusalem-Est parce qu'il y avait ces conditions politiques. Donc il y a une bataille aussi et tout le monde l'a compris maintenant en Palestine que la culture peut être parmi vraiment les grands piliers. Mais ça n'empêche pas qu'il y a des gens et des groupes qui sont contre la musique et qui voient que c'est haram, c'est quelque chose qui n'est pas utile et pour laquelle on a brûlé l'école de musique Al-Kamandjâti en 2007 à Jénine et qu'on a recommencé, et pour laquelle on a eu pas mal d'attaques de côté Hébron pour que dans la ville d'Hébron des partis Tahriri qui sont un peu, on va dire, presque des salafistes en fait, qui ne veulent pas qu'on apprend la musique. Donc le challenge il est de tous les côtés et de toute façon tu peux le savoir. Quand tu as l'extrémisme de colonialisme d'un côté qui te bouscule et l'extrémisme même local qui te bouscule, ça veut dire que tu fais quelque chose d'extraordinaire.
Just to quickly add to that, one of the things that Ramzi said when we first started doing interviews is that music can protect the children from the soldiers. And to be honest, I was a little skeptical, if you take that literally. But even, how much can a child feel safe from soldiers by playing music? Well, it turns out quite a lot. There's been studies in Northern Ireland and South Africa, and I saw it myself with many of the musicians, but I think of Rasha Shalalda, who is the sister of the girl on the cover, Alat Shalalda, and she described when she played the flute that there would be this, she would feel inside this shell of protection, and her own spirit, her own way of feeling strong and feeling like she could persevere through it. This was something really genuine, and I think this is one of the things that people may not recognize right away from what music can do for someone's own self-image. And again, referring to that amazing Mozart concert in the middle of the checkpoint, it was something that gave these kids. I mean, they were so happy. They felt so strong. And yes, it's only a moment, but it's also something that will always be part of them. So I think that this resistance is, and this sort of self image of the children is something that's really can be enduring as well.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. I'm Sandrine Mansour. I'm a historian specialized on the history of Palestine. I'm happy to see you and know you and see Ramzi. It is more a personal question because I know John from the research center at the university. And how come you ended up both working on the Arab world in a different way? And what brought you on this? Because you explained from your work and John from the research, but it's really funny being from the same family.
Yeah.
You end up working on the Arab world in a general way.
Couple of guys from Milwaukee. I mean, you think we go into brewing or something? You know, it's funny. It's a very different paths. I've thought it would be so fun to work on something together someday. Maybe we will. Who knows? But for me, I started out, working in Navajo country, looking at dispossession questions among Native peoples. I've done a lot of that work along the U.S.-Mexico border. I've just been doing this documentary and magazine work on Haitian sugarcane cutters who are under incredible exploitation by these Florida billionaires on this giant 250,000-acre plantation in the Dominican Republic. And I did a series for public radio in the 90s with several other journalists called Vanishing Homelands. So my own identity in these questions of dispossession, identity, ethnicity, natural resources. Before I met Ramzi, I did a whole series on water in Palestine and Israel and how you can look at the dynamics of power through water. It's really striking how you can understand the power dynamics by seeing who has the right to divert a river, who has the right to drill a well. Palestinians don't, even though the water is right underneath their feet in the West Bank. So those have always interested me. And also, not coincidentally, I was married to a Palestinian for 7 years. And so I grew up with the Leon Uris story I was telling you. But then when I met Lamise and we went to, her family is a Palestinian Christian family from Bethlehem. They lived on Star Street, so named because it ends at the Star of Bethlehem and the Church of the Nativity. And her whole family has been in exile. And her mother was, after the peace process, it was possible for her to go back to Bethlehem. But she refused to go to ask permission from the Israeli embassy in Amman to go back to her home. So she died without ever having gone back. So part of it was, for me, it was just, I was always attracted to those kinds of stories, and I had been reading, speaking of exceptions in the New York Times, there's an amazing reporter named John Kiffner I used to read a lot. He was a fantastic journalist, and I was very interested in going, and then all of a sudden all these things personally and professionally came together. So it was really quite, John and I had our very independent paths, but we end up on some of the same work, and it would be fun to do something together someday.
It's funny you are talking about the Navajos and your interest in all these questions, because as a historian, I work a lot in the archives, and I discovered in the French archives, which are in Nantes, were very rich, the diplomatical archives mainly in Nantes, and there's a very big file. In 1924, the Zionist movement brought Elwood Mead. He was an American who specialized in stealing the lands from the Indians and who had the knowledge, and he was specialist in all these questions to find where the water was, how to change the nature, change the trees. And so he went to Palestine and visited the whole Palestine. Of course, he never met a Palestinian, and he made a full report, which is used up to today by the Israelis, by the Zionists, to change the structure, the agricultural and geographical structure, by changing the trees and giving them all the information on the water resources. But he had the experience from doing this against the Indians in the United States. So I don't know if you heard about him.
I didn't
Elwood
know that
Mead.
at all.
Mm.
It's amazing that the sort of enduring colonial power of one of the things I learned in researching Children of the Stone was, the horrific practice of home demolitions that started under the British. That started, and I didn't know that. That started, during, I think, the Arab Revolt of the 1930s. The British began just blowing up houses and executing militants.
Ramzi parlait du pouvoir de la musique. Récemment, il y a un témoignage qui m'a fait plaisir, qui est passé il y a 15 jours dans les circuits. C'est des Italiens qui ont été bloqués à Shenpot, à Hébron. Ils se sont mis à chanter Bella Ciao. Et en chantant Bella Ciao, les soldats les ont laissés passer. Ça veut dire qu'il y a non seulement le pouvoir de la musique, mais aussi le pouvoir du chant.
Oui, malheureusement, ça nous a arrivé, et Sandy, il était là, ça a déjà arrivé à des élèves, à des enfants, de passer sur des barrages, et ils étaient obligés de jouer. Et il y a eu une grande discussion, il y a eu tout un chapitre. Peut-être, Sandy, tu peux dire quelque chose sur ce moment de...
Sure. Yeah. So it was Allah, who was 10 years old at the time. She was she must be about 25 now, right?
Yes.
So this was when she was 10, so it was about 15 years ago. And as I recall, they were coming back from a concert in Bethlehem to go home to Ramallah, and they got stopped by a soldier at a checkpoint, and she had her violin, and her sister Rasha had her flute, and I think Montasser had his clarinet, right? And there was maybe a couple of other musicians there, and they were in a van, and the soldier opens the sliding door of the van and says, get out. Well, what's that you got? He looked at the littlest, most vulnerable, of course, the 10-year-old, and says, what do you have in there? She said, it's a violin. It's like, well, open the case. 10-year-old. She pulls it out, shows the violin. Play me something. And she was obviously intimidated. And she got out, and Rasha started yelling at her, don't do it, refuse to do it. And then she said, no, it's okay. And she began to play. Remember what the song was?
Helwadi.
Yeah, tell about Helwadi.
Helwadi, yes.
Yeah, it's. Can you just say something about the song? I can actually find a line from that song, but Helwadi is a traditional Palestinian.
No, it's Egyptian.
Oh, it's Egyptian. Okay,
yes.
I can't remember. So this is from that chapter, and Allah says, we saw in his eyes he watched. He's something he didn't understand, as a haunting melody floated from Allah's little violin, an oriental sound, as it was called in Israel and the West, certain and strong. Allah's notes cut through the low rumble of idling cars and floated above the flying checkpoint into the night air. Flying, so named because sometimes they erect checkpoints just on the fly to surprise people in case they were smuggling. Another soldier walked over to listen. But I'm trying to see in the melody. So in Helwadi, the sisters could recall the words about a penniless child whose mood is serene, for she has put her life in God's hands. With patience, change will come. All will be better. And that's what she told me she was thinking as she was playing that song. And that's going back to the question of, is this music really powerful? Is it really a form of resistance? Will Allah ever forget that moment? Not that she should have experienced it, but she was the one who triumphed in that moment, at least under one interpretation. But I'll just add to this. So when the book came out, and my wife Andrea, married to Andrea now, and I went to Palestine, and we did some events with Ramzi, and we were playing. I was doing the reading, and we had prearranged with Allah, who was there that night. As I was talking about this incident, and I was talking about the music, she came up behind us and started playing that song. And I tell you, that was worth the entire 5-year experience of writing that book. It was such a beautiful moment.
Thank you, Sandy. Anne, c'est vrai que moi, je dis que j'ai eu une chance impressionnante parce que j'ai eu la chance d'être capté par un photographe quand j'avais 8 ans. Donc j'ai eu la chance de pouvoir continuer à dire mon histoire. Je suis pas juste qu'une affiche qu'on accroche sur le mur et c'est fini. Donc j'ai eu cette photo qui m'a après servi énormément pour le développement d'Al-Kamandjâti et des écoles de musique. Après faire les liens entre la résistance et la culture. Et qui m'a permis aussi d'être cherché par quelqu'un comme Sandy, par plein de journalistes. Donc, et toute ma pensée à tous les enfants qui n'ont pas eu cette chance, qu'ils ont été tués en fait, et qu'on a accroché juste leurs photos en Palestine sur le mur. Mais quelque chose qui m'a beaucoup, en fait, qui m'a rendu fier et que à chaque fois qui me vient à l'esprit en fait, c'est qu'en fait, avec je remercie beaucoup Sandy qui a accepté, parce qu'on a eu beaucoup de pression pendant le début de ramener ce livre à l'extérieur, de le sortir en fait, de ne pas, j'aurais pu ne pas avoir cette occasion de dire et raconter mon histoire autant que palestinien. Il y a eu, si Sandy te rappelle, il y a eu beaucoup de tentatives par les terres de pousser et faire deux histoires, le palestinien et l'israélien, comme si les palestiniens n'existaient pas. Et je peux vous garantir, et moi je le sais, et Sandy le sait, et beaucoup de gens le sachent, que si j'avais accepté cette offre, on aura vendu peut-être de centaines de milliers de livres, mais ça serait plus mon histoire. Ça serait le palestinien à travers l'israélien, et tout c'est contribué aussi à l'amalgame et à l'ambiguïté qu'on a déjà ajoutée. Ok, c'est vrai que le livre n'est pas été vendu à centaines de milliers mais au moins c'est notre histoire.
Other questions?
No. Sandy, you have nothing to say?
I'm very proud of the work that we did and the fact that you trusted me. You know, it's one thing for a journalist to probe and probe and probe for more and more and more detail. It's our job, but also you ask very, very painful questions with very, very painful answers. And you know, over time, as I mentioned before, Ramzi, I think, began to trust that my motivations were to be as truthful to his story and to be as honest a witness as possible. And you know, this is one thing that I remember is that Ramzi told me once that it was when I decided to start going back to the piano after 40 years. I started learning the piano again, and I did it with the express purpose of trying to understand how frustrating it is to learn a musical instrument. And because I wanted to get inside his head when he was in Angers, and he was a very beginning violinist with maybe 1-2 years experience, like how, and then to be in another culture and to at first not even speak French or much at all, right? And so what was this like? And then you have these very strict teachers at the conservatoire, right? And who were great for you, but also not easy. So I was trying to imagine. I had a very nice piano teacher, so you know it's good. But I was trying to get into the mindset and the mental approach of what it would be like. And so I was trying to empathize and place myself. And I think Ramzi told me later when he saw that, then he realized that I was very serious about trying to tell this story, and I was. But I'm very proud of what we've done, Ramzi, and the fact that we're sitting here all these years later.
Yes.
It's a good sign.
Je ne sais pas s'il y a d'autres questions. On peut passer à la musique un peu.
Juste une question brève pour Ramzi, parce que tu as parlais de services israéliens qui te considèrent comme terroriste et considèrent la culture comme dangereuse. Est-ce que tu as eu des relations plus positives avec soit les associations culturelles musicales israéliennes, soit la gauche israélienne de quelque manière que ce soit?
Eh ben, en fait, si tu veux, pour répondre à cette question, il y a tout à l'heure, j'avais fait un petit clin d'œil sur ça. En fait, c'est que j'ai tenté et j'ai collaboré avec Daniel Barenboim et avec cet orchestre West Eastern Divan Orchestra qui a été créé par Edward Said et Barenboim. Donc j'étais invité, je suis allé et j'ai découvert qu'en fait que je jouais avec des musiciens en fait ultra extrémistes. Ça veut dire en fait c'est vraiment des sionistes convaincus. En fait ils sont là juste ils ont appris que ça coûte rien de dire qu'on veut la paix. En fait c'est juste des répétitions en fait devant les caméras. Mais lorsque je suis rentré en détail en fait avec eux, et c'est pour ça en fait j'y suis allé 2 ans et demi, j'ai creusé moi-même, j'ai parlé avec les 40 Israéliens qui étaient dans l'orchestre. J'ai jamais été d'accord. J'ai apprécié beaucoup Daniel Barenboim et Mariam Saïd parce qu'en fait, je l'ai eu plusieurs fois. Elle m'a traité que je suis en train de parler mal de l'orchestre. J'ai dit, excuse-moi, je parle pas mal de l'orchestre, je parle de mon expérience en tant que musicien dans l'orchestre. J'ai le droit de critiquer et au moins je suis parmi les personnes le plus qualifiées pour parler parce que j'ai vécu pendant 2 ans et demi, donc je peux dire ce que j'ai senti. Donc cette expérience, c'est que en fait, ça ajoute encore de l'amalgame, de la fausse information sur ce qui se passe en Palestine, parce que ces 40 Israéliens qui sont assis dans l'orchestre, aucun veut sortir de la Cisjordanie parce que pour eux, soi-disant, c'est la Judaï-Samaria et il faut que ça reste ensemble avec Israël. Jérusalem-Est, c'est impossible parce qu'en fait, il faut que ça reste une capitale unifiée pour Israël. Les réfugiés peuvent pas revenir parce que après il y aura plus Israël. Et voilà, on veut la paix, mais comme ça. Dans ces conditions. Donc j'ai découvert cette vérité en fait au sein. Et je lui ai dit à Barenboim, je lui ai dit à Mariam que c'est pas correct ce qui se passe. Et donc on a eu quand même des petits échanges en fait. Sur ça, j'ai essayé d'instaurer une déclaration au sein de l'orchestre pour que je puisse revenir. Je dis, je peux pas revenir dans un orchestre qui n'est pas d'accord pour mon existence. Et aucun n'était d'accord sur cette déclaration. Et je parle que de l'ONU, je parle que de les résolutions de l'ONU. Je parle pas vraiment de rentrer dans le détail autre que les choses basiques en fait. Et on a eu beaucoup de échanges. Et après, je me suis retiré de l'orchestre. Et Sandy a eu la chance d'aller interviewer ces quelques membres et j'étais heureux parce qu'en fait il a eu la même histoire. Donc il a eu Daniel Barenboim lui-même qui a tout d'abord et dis-moi Sandy si je me trompe, qui a refusé d'abord de donner l'interview au début. Daniel Barenboim a bien refusé et après il a réaccepté de donner l'interview. Parce qu'en fait, je disais tout à l'heure, l'éditeur voulait nous rejoindre dans une histoire commune, comme il avait fait Parallèle et Paradoxe avec Edward Said et tout ça. Mais moi, je savais que je serais plus moi en fait, mon histoire. Barenboim, moi je le connais, je travaille avec lui, donc il nous bouffe en fait, il peut tout bouffer en fait avec sa grandeur et tout ça. Et après, il va mener l'histoire comme il veut. Donc, on n'aura plus d'histoire palestinienne. C'est pour ça que j'étais heureux que malgré toutes ces tentatives, vous savez, il y a de la tentation dedans parce que c'est d'avoir un livre avec un grand chef d'orchestre. Pour moi, au niveau personnel, c'est super. Mais il y a l'histoire, il y a la vérité. Que peut-être aujourd'hui, on l'a pas diffusé au monde entier, mais la preuve, elle est là, et elle restera. Je sais pas si Sandy, tu veux dire quelque chose?
You know, I did interview Daniel Barenboim. I don't know that he didn't want to talk to me, but I think he was not comfortable because he knew that I was writing a book about Ramzi, and he very well knew Ramzi's perspective. So he was not very comfortable losing control of the narrative. He is a very grand person, very, you know, honestly full of himself, but also in many ways a great person. I mean, aside from the reality that I agree with the way you describe it completely of the orchestra, he has been very courageous as an Israeli to confront his own government, and there are, you know, he's refused. I think there was a grand prize, the Wolf Prize, that he refused because of the actions of his government related to Palestinians. He became a dual citizen, even though it's only symbolic, of Israel and Palestine. I mean, not a lot of people do that. He was truly dear friends with Edward Said, who's one of the great intellectuals and one of the great people, the greatest writers on Palestine and the Palestinian question. There's a lot of questions about whether Edward Said would be very happy with what has happened to the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, which is the name of the orchestra that Ramzi was in. And, you know, one of the things that I learned, I think you maybe gave me the tip, and I confirmed it, one of his cellists who plays Jacqueline Dupre's cello, because, you know, Barenboim was married to her long ago when she was alive, he was a settler. Okay, so that gives you, I mean, it puts the, you know, it underscores what Ramzi was saying. And so, you know, I interviewed him a couple of times. That it was, you know, one of the great things about being a journalist is you go into these worlds, like the world of Palestine, the things that I've been telling, but also they were playing the whole Beethoven cycle in Germany. And I would go with him, and I'd go backstage, and it was pretty thrilling, honestly. But he was elusive for a while, and finally, I got a couple of interviews with him, and he was very gracious. He was out on the on the patio of a fancy restaurant, smoking his cigar, and he had a lot of affection for Ramzi. He felt Ramzi was misguided. He should have never left the orchestra. Well, you know why he did. He just told you, and I presented these arguments, you know, do you have settlers in the orchestra? And he was very defensive. But I think what I understand is that he did not want to compromise between the musical quality of the musicians and the political positions of those musicians. Because if he would have just said, okay, you have to believe in free Palestine and one state or whatever, or at least be, you know, opposed to the occupation, then his membership of quality Israeli musicians would have shrunk. And so, you know, in the end, I think it was the Arab Israeli orchestra, but a lot of the musicians were Egyptian. There weren't that many Palestinians. By the time you left, I think there was Nabil Boulos, Nabi Boulos, and
Nabil Abou,
a couple of other people.
Yeah.
So it's really it became more of a symbol that was actually not grounded in the truth of what they were the impression they were trying to create. And I was hoping that he would embrace the book just to give it more publicity, but I think he was honestly uncomfortable with it.
Yeah, he was very uncomfortable because they want to tell the Palestinian story from their own eyes of it. They don't want you to tell your story, actually, as you see it, you know, because that's what happened with me. The first year I was there, I mean, Barenboim was asking young girls from Palestine, from West Bank, and boys to go to interview in front of big camera. I told them, you are not allowed to do this. If you want me to stay today, I just arrived this year. You cannot ask a 14 years old girl while you put her in a 5-star hotels and swimming pool. What do you think now? She will forget everything. You know, she's not a politician. You know, she's not able to tell something. At least you have to tell like people at university level or more than 18 years old. But you got to bring kids, you know, and ask them what do you think about peace, you know. in front of BBC and in New York, you know, it's very dangerous, you know. I say, if you do this again, I leave the orchestra. I say, okay, we will stop this now, but you go to the interview. I say, okay, I go to the interview, no problem. And I had to put on again on the right level the discussion. First time I played, you know, with the viola player. Her name is Hayelet, you know, she played viola. And she started to talk, and she say, we are friends. I just came, you know, I just 3 days, you know. And she say, we are friends. I look to the news, and everybody says, she's not my friend. You know, she's not at all my friend, you know. I'm sure she's a soldier. If we want to say the truth now, she's one of my enemy, you know, on the land. I am here to discover if there is hope, you know, if we can see if she agree to the condition of that we become free or not. But if it's not the case, she will never be my friend. I told this, and everybody was shocked in the hall. That was in Brussels, in Beaux-Arts. And Barenboim was looking like this to me. I felt he would take something and throw it on me or something. You know. And later on, he understood that this is more interesting than saying just we are in peace, you know. There is no debate, nothing, you know. Okay, I know that in each country I was, in Germany, in Italy, I learned all language to understand what he said. You know, I try to have translation to do like an analysis to what he said. In Germany, he have a speech. In Italian, he have another speech. In Spanish, another speech. In Palestine, he's have a speech more than Palestinian. But what I told him, how can serve me to tell me in Palestine that you want my freedom? Just go tell this to Paris, you know, to people in Paris, in Berlin, but not to Palestinian, you know. When I saw him, people were very happy in Palestine, saying, "Oh, fantastic, you know, big freedom for Palestine." But you go to Berlin, it's not the same speech. You have another speech, you know, and that's what get me really very, very angry, you know, because there is no truth in the functioning, you know. And add to this the 40 musicians who don't want you to live in peace, and actually they want you to go out actually of your home. Sorry.
No.
I spoke in English, sorry.
Don't apologize to me. Just to add to that, when I first met Ramzi, I did a radio piece before I even thought about the book, and I managed to get an interview. I think Barenboim was in Berlin, and he went into his studio and did a telephone interview, you know, onto the microphone in the studio. And, you know, just to show that he was conflicted, I think. He had such affection for Ramzi. He said Ramzi has transformed not only his life, his destiny, but that of many, many, many other people. This is an extraordinary collection of children from all over Palestine that have been inspired and open to the beauty of life. And he believed that, and I believe it. It's just that these other complications made things really too difficult.
Yeah, it's, you know, you have to do concession in life, you know, and that was like really a very big moment for my life, because I was very close to him, you know. I mean, we were very close, and he would listen, like, you know. I had the privilege sometimes to be immediately in his lodge, you know, in the backstage. When we go immediately out of the orchestra, he'd say, "Come immediately," and I had the chance to meet the chancellor from Germany, all the Israeli ambassador in every country. He looked to them, you know, he would take it. He said, "This guy threw stones on the soldier and the jeep. Maybe your son was soldier at that time, and he injured him, you know." And they would look at me like this, you know. And he say, yes, and he's a big musician, and you have to respect him, you know. And he's playing my orchestra, you know. It was always like this big. But when I think of it, I say, what does it bring to Palestine to play in Paris, in Berlin, in Italy? Is it, and adding to this all the wrong information that we are giving, because European would like to hear that it's going well in Palestine. Like this, they don't have any problem of conscience, and they go sleep well. and nothing to do to stop this in Palestine. Anyway, I will play something maybe before we